All right, morning everyone. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm just a postdoctoral research fellow at the MICD here in Johannesburg, and I'll just be talking about viruses through space and time. And yeah, it's a bit different to probably what you're hearing for the rest of the day, but hopefully you'll find it informative. So as you might have gathered, I'm not talking about the viral nature of cat memes, but rather viruses that cause disease in humans. And just to give a bit of background on what virus is, so virus is this very small particle made up of proteins, fats, and nucleic acid. And contrary to a lot of people's thinking, they're not alive. So they require a living host to replicate. We don't say reproduce because they're not living, but replicate and produce more of themselves. And scientists have many theories on where these where viruses come from. So one of the kind of predominant theories is that they're actually kind of rogue pieces of material from living things that have kind of gone rogue and gone on this separate trajectory to the rest of life. The other theory is that they kind of predate life itself during the time when you had self-replicating molecules, which then gave rise to living organisms. And so for a virus to infect a host, it needs to do a couple of things. The one thing is that all viruses have on their surface these what we call virus spikes. And so you can see these in the two diagrams on the right. And these are these structures on the surface of the virus which are needed by the virus to attach themselves to host cells and enter a host cell. So that's the first barrier that a virus needs to overcome to infect a host. The second is that for a virus then to cause infection in the host, they need to evade host defenses. So in mammals, this is the immune system. And then thirdly, for a virus then to go global or produce a pandemic, they can't just be successful inside a single individual. They need to be able to be transmitted between hosts, and this requires the virus to adapt to become more transmissible between hosts. And so where do most of the viruses that cause disease in humans come from? Well, most of them come from animals, and this is something we call spilling over into humans. And so on the right, we have a diagram showing the kind of various types of viruses where this has happened. So one is rabies. So often infected dog, the rabies virus moves from the infected dog into human, but the rabies virus doesn't have adaptations which allow it to propagate between individuals or be transmitted between individuals. And so it literally dies out with that single infected individual. Then you have your next kind of group of viruses such as Ebola and dengue. These are transmitted from animals into humans, and then you get a kind of limited transmissibility between human individuals, but generally limited outbreak, and the virus kind of periodically reappears and then disappears. And then lastly, our kind of most dangerous group of pathogens or viruses that have kind of completely made the jump from animals to humans, and such as HIV, and are now purely a human virus. So it's cannot actually reinfect or has lost the ability to be transmitted between the original animal hosts and is now purely a human virus. And so for viruses to become pandemics, they require modern human society. And so, prior to agriculture emerging, humans lived in these relatively small groups of 10 to 100 individuals, following a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and had kind of periodic contact with animals through hunting. However, if a virus made the jump from animals into a human, it would burn through these small groups, leaving the survivors generally immune to the virus, and therefore the virus had nowhere to go and fizzled out. However, this all changed with the emergence of agriculture about 11 to 12,000 years ago. We had much larger communities living together in close proximity, much more sustained contact with animals through domestication, and trade routes linking the various societies. And it's during this time that we see viruses such as measles and smallpox make the jump from animals into human populations. And then lastly, we kind of have our modern society where you have megacities with millions of people living very closely together, global trade and travel links, industrial farming, and importantly, the trafficking of wild animals into these cities. And this just creates kind of high probability environment for viruses to make the jump from wild animals into either domesticated animals and then into humans, or directly into human populations. And so I just want to talk a bit about some disease I'm very much involved in, and that is the HIV-1M pandemic. And so it is, contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, it's kind of very well understood where HIV came from. And so originally you had viruses that circulate in wild monkey populations in Central Africa, and this is called simian immunodeficiency virus. And the ancestor of HIV originally made the jump from two monkey species into chimps, because chimps quite like to eat these two monkeys. And the virus then kind of spread through these chimpanzee populations. And somewhere in the beginning of the 20th century, we think a hunter in Central Africa, probably while butchering a chimpanzee, because humans in this region, apes are a kind of an important food source. The virus, through that butchering process, made the jump from the chimpanzee into a human. And our evidence shows that this has probably occurred multiple times in human history, this jumping of monkey viruses or simian immunodeficiency viruses into humans. However, it has only gone global once, and this is what has caused our current HIV pandemic. And so how this happened is the virus originally made the jump, we think, in southeastern Cameroon, and then probably around the early 20th century, and then spread through trade routes down into what was then a colonial city of Leopoldville, now known as Kinshasa, and through kind of local trade networks. And it was really colonialism and the colonial environment in Kinshasa at the time. We had this major influx of a lot of men from various areas into Kinshasa, and kind of a very prolific sex work trade going on, that the virus kind of gained a foothold in a human population and was able to sustain itself. And then obviously your kind of colonial transport networks then allowed the virus to be exported out of Africa and to the rest of the world. And the virus went global somewhere around the 1940s or 1950s, but was only detected or became widely known in the 1980s. And so just moving on to kind of our current circumstance, the new novel coronavirus, and where did this come from? Well, originated in Wuhan in China, probably in a wet market. These are areas where live animals are brought and kept alive and then killed and butchered for customers, and lots of different kind of trafficked animals. And so what we think happened for the coronavirus is that the ancestral virus probably was circulating in bats. Bats host a wide range of coronaviruses, and then made a jump in the wet market to an intermediate host, which is thought to be a trafficked pangolin. And then the virus then jumped from the pangolin into humans, probably through butchering and cooking of the pangolin. And so this outbreak is largely unprecedented in kind of the speed with which it spread. And this is largely due to the unique biology of this novel coronavirus, and that it has adaptations which are very improbable, that make it highly transmissible between humans. And so, I mean, if we look back to the beginning of this year, 3rd of January, there were reports coming out of China where they'd seen small clusters of infection, but they suspected no human-to-human transmission. Now, we know this is false. There was obviously extensive transmission, probably from as early as November or December last year. And so, we're currently in the space of a few months sitting at, global pandemic with many countries showing cases of upwards of 100,000. So, where does this go and how does it end? So I guess there are three possible scenarios. One is that this virus, similar to the 1918 flu epidemic, burns through the human population, leaving those infected who survive immune, and the virus eventually runs out of fuel and ends. The second is that we put in long-term restrictions and are successful at controlling the virus. And this is similar to kind of fire breaks in kind of using the forest metaphor that kind of slows the spread of the wildfire. And the third is that we are able to develop treatments to reduce the severity of disease, or a vaccine which could prevent people from becoming infected. And I guess, just a huge advocate for vaccination. I think it's an amazing technology which has, over the course of the 20th century, largely managed to either eliminate or severely decrease the incidence of many viral diseases in our world. And so, it's something that we probably will have, but not in the immediate sense. And so I'd just like to end my talk there. And thank you all for listening, and hopefully you learned something. And I'll now take any questions from the audience.